Everyone. My name is Amanda Elliott, and I'm with the Town of Gilbert. You are at the session Leveraging Your Website, Building Your Brand. And our speakers for this event include Deirdre Gilmore, who's the president and lead strategist for Tankerl Marketing, and George Dematakis, the president and CEO of Pat Davis Design Group. I've had the good fortune of working with both of these individuals in work that we've done through the Town of Gilbert and also with AAD, where Deirdre has served on a number of committees, as well as the AAD board, and with George, who currently serves on the PR and communications committee. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with this group. We want this to be an open dialogue. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and then I'll find a time to stop Deirdre or George within their presentation to really be able to hone in on some of those questions, and we'll just make sure we get those answered. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Deirdre and George to get us started this morning.
Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to be here today. And as Amanda said, we built a lot of time in here for interaction and questions. So please interact. I hope y'all can appreciate how hard it is to present to like nobody. And so we love it when you interact with us. So let's get started. So let's talk about branding, and especially branding when it relates to economic development and some of the things that we've seen within that realm. So I think the first thing to understand is that most people, when they think of branding, they think of their logo, maybe their tagline and their color palette. And really a brand is so much larger than that. And so what I want to talk about is reframing it for economic development under this kind of guideline. A brand is a shared system of beliefs and values that define an organization and attract others to it. And what's meant by that is, think about, the difference between people that shop at Nordstrom's, Macy's, and Dillard's, right? They're all really similar stores, but there's something about each one of those stores and the experience, the culture, that is more attractive to one person or another. And that's really what you want to think about when you're thinking about your brand for your economic development organization is what is our culture? What are we, who are we, and what is that experience that people that interact with us are going to get? So what's the power of a brand? Number one, just what I said, it tells them what they can expect and what makes you different. And I think that's something we're going to talk a lot about today, because when we look at the different economic development cities, organizations, and how they're stacking up against each other, boy, it is really hard to differentiate, and other than rural and metro, it seems like. Number two, if people understand what they're going to get from you, it shortens the sales cycle, right? It makes that decision making easier for them. So with that, it builds trust and reduced risk, right? You're adding value already by just telling them what they're going to get from you. The biggest thing about a brand is it appeals to emotion and reason. It connects you to humans. And there's a tenet we have in marketing that people buy on emotions and use facts to back it up. And you see that so clearly in just the case of Nordstrom's, Macy's, and Dillard's, right? The facts are they're all selling about the same products for about the same price. But there's an emotional appeal in that experience, in that brand that you're getting with them, right? It's that human connection. It's not about the products, it's about the experience. And so lastly, it attracts new businesses. But what I want you guys to think about on top of that is it inspires your stakeholders and your employees. And I imagine you're no different than any other industry right now, where you're probably stretched really thin for human resources, and you're always trying to attract really great people to your organization, as well as the businesses to your city. So having a really clear defined brand is also going to help with recruiting and retention within your organizations. So the biggest mistakes that we see in economic development branding, and George, I'd love for you to chime in here because I know you see this all the time too, is number one, back to what I just said, thinking it's just your logo and your color palette when it's so much more than that. And we're going to talk about that in depth here. Number two, lack of differentiation. Y'all look the same most of the time. You say the same things. Number three, really lacks the human element. A lot of times we just see so much data within your brands and your websites and your collateral without any emotional appeal, without connecting it to the why is this information important to them? What does that mean to them? And again, while you're attracting businesses, businesses are run by people. You're trying to attract people that have emotions and drivers and agendas that you need to understand in order to speak to them appropriately. George, you got anything to say on this one?
I think those are fantastic points, Divya. And I would just add to that, that in each of those, it's also an important consideration that in that diversification and that uniqueness, that you're also really thinking about your brand traits as well, right? So with the components, I know we're going to talk to those, but just to tuck that in the back of your mind as you're thinking of differentiating is what those traits might be as well.
Absolutely. So again, branding isn't just a logo, name, or tagline. And I thought this was actually a really interesting article that I found. So I left the whole link in here for you guys from this Ryan Short. And this whole article was just about how branding is the new economic development. And really the points that I pulled out of that I thought were most interesting is going back to the things that we're seeing that are issues within your branding, which is number one, what truly makes your area unique? And if you're Mesa and Gilbert like backed right up to next to each other, how do you differentiate against that, right? And so really what I thought was interesting is he said, even if it currently just lies in potential. And I think that's the thing is telling your prospects, not just where you are and who you are right now, but where you're trying to go and how they're going to fit into that potential. And then really building a platform and strategy around it that nurtures the brands and attracts others who share that value and vision. And again, what I think is important to understand in a brand is that a lot of times, you know, when we're trying to attract, we want to be all things to everybody. And when you do that, you're nothing to no one. And so it is so important to really dig deep and say, who are we? Who do we want to be? And what are the types of people we want to attract and focus on them? The other people that want to come will still come. But if you don't have a very clear, differentiated message, then it makes it really hard, right? That's about shortening that sales cycle. If you sound just like everyone else, it makes it harder to make a decision to pick you. And here was the other key point that I brought out of his article that I thought was so interesting and really, you know, goes to that point of businesses are run by people and people are looking more out of the places that they live and work. So really understanding how you can position yourselves to attract amazing talent, that's going to get you further than all the business incentives in the world, right? Because a business incentive will get them there, but it won't keep them there. And you need to keep them there as well, right? It's recruiting and retention. So really looking at what do you offer them beyond the business incentives. So developing a strong civic brand is done through a phase. I love processes, right? So first thing, when you're really looking at defining or redefining probably your brand, is the first thing you do is you've got to engage with the people that are already there. I think a lot of times we get very myopic in branding and we think about it all from our perspective within the organization. And we really never step outside and ask the people that are currently engaging with the brand what their perception of it is. And so whenever we take on any kind of branding project, whether it's for a, you know, a company or an economic development organization or any other type of entity, the first thing we do is we do what we call a brand perception survey, where we reach out to the people that are interacting with that brand and we ask them one very clear question. What stands out the most when interacting with X entity? Very open-ended question. And I'll tell you, if you ask enough people, you'll start getting really common themes. And those themes are what your brand is. That's your brand. Whatever everybody else is saying about your brand is what your brand is. Now, that might not be where you want to take your brand, right? You've got a vision for your brand and this is who you want to be, but this is where you currently are, and understanding where those benchmarks are and how far you have to move that needle is critical in developing a brand. Because if it's really far apart, you're going to have to do that brand transition incrementally, right? Because you can't just overnight completely do a 180 on your brand and expect the people that are currently existing and loving that brand to go along with that. And what I mean by that is those of you, I'm going to date myself a little bit here probably, but who remembers like when New Coke came out, right? Basically, it was kind of the same Coke and they just repackaged it a little bit and people freaked out, right? They completely freaked out because there was a lot of brand equity there, so much brand equity, and they didn't roll it out in a way that helped to move that needle. And so people immediately rejected it. And so doing a current perception and public engagement with your current brand is incredibly important. Once you figure out what your current brand is, and you've got an idea of where you want to take that brand, Then you're going to start defining those brand principles. And really that is the logo, the tagline, the color palette, the fonts, right? What are the existing brand principles that are going to be established? And be prepared for that to be a lengthy process with a lot of input along the way, especially in an organization, right? You've got a lot of layers of red tape to get through. You know, some institutions, we can do this process of a rebrand in 8 to 10 weeks. With governmental institutions, it can be up to a year sometimes. And so be prepared for a long haul. The third thing is storytelling. And I think this is where things get often left out. Is it's great to have the vision, mission, tagline, all that stuff, but people need to understand the story of the brand, because brands are stories, right? And so if people ask you, you know, I get the question all the time. Obviously, I have a kind of weird company name, Tank Girl Marketing. Deirdre, where'd that name come from? And you better believe I've got like 10 different stories I can tell depending on who I'm talking to and what I think they're most gonna resonate with, right? So you need to understand the story of your brand just as much as the colors of the brand that you're using. To me, that's most important, is what is the story? What's that emotional appeal? People are attracted to stories. So really developing the stories around that brand and making sure everybody in the organization understands those stories, because they're going to get asked too. And if, you know, they go to one person and one person tells this really great story, and then they go to the next person, they're like, I don't know, that doesn't look very good, right? And your brand is, again, the user experience. So everyone needs to understand the stories.
Deirdre,
But
with
to me, yeah,
with that
please.
too, I think what
Yeah.
the storytelling does is creates that authenticity. I'm looking kind of at the view, and it looks like there's other cities here, and I can't tell you how many times the cities we were told, we want to be like X city. And, you know, as economic developers, we sometimes have to push back on our leadership and our, you know, city officials to say, we don't want to be homogenous. We want to tell our, you know, we want to tell our authentic story, because that's really what, exactly what you said, resonates with people. And
Right.
to be true, you know, we need to be true to ourselves in that story.
Absolutely. Being true to yourself is the most important thing in a brand. And that's literally leads to my next bullet, which is consistency, consistently fulfilling your brand promise. Because I have seen this over and over with brands. I'll never forget when I first moved here to Phoenix in 2004. Now, I'd come from the Bay Area. We were pretty green to start with. So I move here and I go to work for an agency. And their biggest thing they touted was how green they were, that they followed lead principles. They were so green, this and that and this and that. But I'll tell you what, you looked out in the parking lot and all you saw were big, giant Ford F-150s. You did not see recycling bins all over the office. You did not see compostable products being used, right? And that really, like, to me, kind of set a bad taste of like, you're just whitewashing here. And so I think consistently fulfilling your brand promise is the most important thing, because again, your brand is the people's experience with it. And so going back to defining those clear brand principles and having good storytelling and making sure everybody in the organization is walking the talk, consistently fulfilling that brand promise is the most important step here, guys, is you've actually got to do what you say you are. Okay, so what are the components of branding? I think everybody thinks about, you know, collateral materials, what we put in events, our ads, our website, our value proposition, our logo. But again, I want to come back to user experience. That is the number one thing. And so as you're trying to move that needle through your brand refresh, you're going to want to be doing a lot of checking in with your users to see if that's working, right? Is this brand aligning with what you're experiencing still, and checking in on them all the time.
I just want
Okay.
to jump in and say
Yeah.
100% agree on that. That is critical, I think, in every piece of the branding, and should be consistently thought of in the implementation as well. So not, like you said, just beyond, but just the key
Yes.
critical point. Absolutely.
Right. You can't just launch a brand and expect it to fly, right? There's a lot of work to be done here. But the good thing is about developing a brand development, there's a 5-step process. I love processes and I love when I can count them off. So let's talk about them. So number one, just what I said before, you need to conduct a brand identity assessment, right? You need to understand, do you already have considerable brand equity, and are people really in love with that brand? Because changing it is going to be really difficult if that's the case, right? But if most people are kind of ambivalent, or they feel like it's time for a change, then you're in a good spot. And so, Amanda, I think back to how many years ago was that we did a brand equity assessment for Gilbert. Can you talk a little bit about what we did there?
Yeah, I want to say, goodness, it might have been about 5 years ago already. But what we did was exactly kind of the conversation you had earlier about calling people and understanding really what they thought about Gilbert. And that did two things. It did allow us to see the trends and to be able to say, these are the trends we want to follow, or this is actually where we need to start to differentiate our marketing. But it also did something really unique in it allowed us to see how many people remembered us and us to go back and say, I've had 10 touch points, for example, with this person who barely remembers Gilbert, but I've had 100 touch points with this person who clearly has an idea of what our brand and what we're doing in our city. You're showing our logo there. We went through a rebrand. So when we work with Deirdre, we really work to hone in on messaging specific to economic development. And the town has gone through a rebrand now that ties all of our brands together. Whereas we had different brands. We had an economic development brand, we had our town brand, we had a digital brand, and Parks and Rec had their own brand. And so we're really tying those back together. But what's been interesting through that process and kind of ties back to what we did with Deirdre, we launched our brand and we heard from the residents loud and clear that they were very concerned that the water tower was not included in our brand. But I grew up in Minnesota. Water towers are everywhere in every city in Minnesota. And so, yes, they're unique to the desert area, but when we think about who's our audience in a larger capacity, who we're trying to reach, certainly our citizens are a critical part of that. But a water tower isn't going to resonate with a site selector. And so we really had to, go back to what was the message, going back to some of the work that we did with Deirdre and being able to share that with our digital group to say, this is what the perception is from our site selectors. And that was one component to them creating, this shaping the future concept.
Absolutely. So that goes to clearly my next point, which is being clear on your target audiences. And so when we're developing a brand, we literally pull out a matrix and we say, who are all of the different audiences that we're talking to? And that could be, the more specific you can get, the better, right? So we're trying to pull gun manufacturers from Montana and creating an audience profile for that person. We're trying to recruit and retain businesses from, 3 towns over, getting really clear on who that audience member is. We're trying to get site selectors to choose us. So who are those people? What are their demographics? What are their profiles? We're trying to recruit and retain staff for our department. Who are those people? What are their profiles? And once you start creating those audience profiles, then you can take your overall brand message and start tweaking it to those different profiles. And then the next thing I'll do is I'll create another map next to those to say, what are all the different mediums that I'm going to speak to these people through? Because different people are reached through different mediums, right? And once I have that matrix, the next thing I do is I pull up the competition and I say, how are we stacking up? Are we really sounding different? If not, how can we tweak this message? How can we get more granular? How can we appeal more to the emotional side and really stand out apart? And so what I think is interesting is, I just randomly grabbed these 4 off of the different economic development websites. And to Amanda's point, what I thought was interesting is I feel like the last 10 years, economic development groups have really wanted to have their own brand distinct from the cities. And now I'm kind of starting to see them wrapped back into the brand. So I thought this was interesting where Gilbert was all one brand. Mesa did have separate, Tempe was all one. Scottsdale had its own separate brand for its economic development. I think that, again, you need to go back to, is it worth it to water down the brand? Is there a reason to have a separate brand for your economic development? There may or may not be. I mean, if you're a really large city, there might be a really good reason to have a separate brand, because once you go on that overall website, everything gets real overwhelming. But I think that's part of what you have to determine in that brand identity assessment is it worth it to have a separate brand? What value are we going to get out of having a separate brand versus wrapping it into an already recognizable brand? Right? So really digging deep on who you are, who you want to be, what equity you have in that brand so far, who are the people you're talking to, and how are you going to appeal to them? And then lastly, how are you stacking up against your competition? That is really the largest part of starting your branding process.
Deirdre, there's a question in the chat that I think is
Yeah.
really great. It comes from Chad, and he says, brand assessments seem to be only able to work if you have a third party ask and pull that information. So for example,
Yes.
if he asks Gilbert what they think of White's construction, it may not be as honest or straightforward as that third party. Can you talk about that a little bit, maybe your experience in that?
Mhm. Absolutely. So first of all, when you're doing an assessment of this type, this is not something you mail out to people. These are phone calls and conversations you're having with people, number one. Number two, it takes talent to have that kind of conversation. It takes someone that's trained in surveying people to really get the best information from them, someone that knows how to listen for the pauses, who knows how to ask the right follow-up questions, who knows how to kind of dig deeper and dig deeper and dig deeper to keep that person on the line and get as much information as possible is incredibly important. Not everyone knows how to do that. I think number three, the value of having an outside party on any kind of survey, when you really want qualitative versus rank us 1 through 10 type information, is that people are they don't want to give direct feedback a lot of the time. It's very uncomfortable for them, especially if it's not great feedback. And so having a third party that is not attached to the results of the conversation is helpful for both parties. Number one, it's helpful for the person being surveyed because they just don't feel like this is going to be so personal. It's more removed for them to be able to give direct feedback. It's also more helpful for the organization, I think, because if you have someone within your organization doing that survey, they already have a bias and an agenda. And if they hear something they don't like, it's going to be so common for them to want to defend or explain. And if they hear something they do like, they might quit listening. And so really a third party, third objectivity is really key in this process, because we all know any survey can be skewed based on agendas. And so someone that's not involved in your agenda is going to be more beneficial to the project, I think. Okay. Step number two, again, you've kind of figured out what that brand is. Now you really want to strengthen that unique value proposition, and it's called unique for a reason, right? What is going to make you stand out from everyone else? So really what this means is you're sitting down and you're selecting those key aspects of your region and making a compelling case to your target audience members. And again, so if you've done your work in your brand assessment and you've really dug deep and gotten granular on who those audience members are, and you've really done the work to figure out what are the key aspects of your region no one else can say, now you're finding your unique value proposition. And so what I thought was interesting is, again, I was scrolling everybody's sites back and forth. And so I thought Gilbert, again, it was interesting. Their tagline, world-class companies choose Gilbert, right? And then, they hit what they felt like was their unique value proposition. And what I loved about it is it was a paragraph, and it wasn't even a super long paragraph. Then I popped over to Scottsdale, and Scottsdale had a lot to say. And I think the thing is the more unique your value proposition is, the less you probably need to say about it. And so to me, if I'm seeing paragraphs, you have not dug deep here. You have not figured out those select key aspects. And again, it goes back to my conversation in the beginning of people wanting to widen their audience as much as possible. The more you widen that audience, the more watered down it all gets. You cannot differentiate for everybody, right? You have to differentiate to your key target audience members and get clear on who those people are. And it's not everyone, I promise you. And there will be people that you're not addressing directly, but they'll still come to you. You're not knocking them out of the running, so to speak. But what you are doing is laser focusing on the people you actually really want, right? It's kind of like dating. Yeah, you can date everyone, but if you got a list of criteria on the people you want to date, you're probably going to get a lot more selective and have a lot better dates. Okay, now you're ready to create your brand's look, feel, and tone. Again, I think most people start off with what kind of imagery you're going to use and what's our color palette going to be. That is step 3 here, right? You've got to figure out these first 2 things before you even start launching into this, because this is where we find brands that are not resonating with their messaging, right? So number 3, create that logo, color palette, images, font type. And I say images because I notice a lot of time on people's websites, their images are just all over the place. Images are part of your brand, and the look and feel of how just a photo is shot and the tones it has to it really makes a huge impact. And so these are the 4 things you really want to look at within the visuals of your brand. But again, beyond that, once you got the visuals down, the most important thing is brand voice. how are you going to sound, right? And so when you look at Arizona, again, when I moved here almost 20 years ago, a lot of the sites I went to were very kind of cowboyish, Wild Westish. And now, you look on them and they're almost all STEM, right? Just tech, 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 data. And so I think it's interesting to watch how brand voices have shifted. But what I've noticed, moreover, is that while the imagery has shifted, the brand voice hasn't necessarily. And so, really, again, your voice is that tone that you're going to be using to connect with those target audience members. So, again, you've got to understand your audience to understand what kind of tone to use, right? So, if you're talking to people in New York, you're talking very differently than if you're talking to people in Idaho, right? So, you really want to think about that. And again, going back to imagery, it was interesting, Amanda, that you said that about the water tower. So we did a brochure a few years back for an entity up north in Arizona, and they were trying to attract people from a very specific region, basically Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, kind of right in there. They had specific manufacturers and people retiring from there they wanted to attract. And so as we were doing the cover of this brochure, one of the stakeholders felt very strongly about this certain office building being on the cover of this brochure and some statuary that was in the front of it. And we fought like tooth and nail about this because I kept saying, to your point, Amanda, people in Montana have no connection to that building. Only you people do internally. This brochure isn't for you, it's for them. So, what is your unique value proposition and how are you reflecting that in your imagery? So, again, when you're thinking about this stuff right now, if I can give you the one very clear piece of advice, is stop looking internally at what you all like and get very clear on those audience members and what's attractive to them, because this is one of the biggest mistakes I see. And again, going with that is that there's no human connection often. Okay. This is the big one, guys, is the rollout strategy. And I don't start the branding without starting, how are we going to roll this brand out? Because if you fail at that point, all of your work is going to go up in smoke and it'll feel so, so bad, right? And the worst thing is, you see something 3 months after you've rebranded, go out of your office and it's got the wrong logo on it, right? All of that kind of stuff. People wearing old shirts, just ick. So you need to start thinking about, how are you going to roll out this new brand? Is it going to be one big grand launch? Or are you going to slowly roll it out? How much money are you going to spend on all of the things that you're going to have to change, right? Like, how are you going to roll this brand out? So one of the things that I do is I literally will start an asset list from day one. Day one, go, and I will go through everything that I can find with that logo on it and make sure I'm keeping all of those in a running list so that we don't miss anything. Number two, I always recommend an internal test run first, because again, if the internal organization is not on board with the rebrand, it will fail when you send it out. Because the minute the outside audiences start interacting with it and engaging with your people, and your people don't know the story and are not in consensus with everything, that's when it starts to happen. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll start kind of giving people even voting early, maybe internally in the organization. Again, we only give them things to vote on that we actually want them to pick. So don't give them options you don't want them to pick. Let's start with that. Give them a couple options, let them vote on it, let them feel like they're getting engaged in this process. Maybe sneak peek things as you're starting to come up with initial designs, and you just got to give them a little peek of it, or a little peek of the new font, or maybe one day you drip out some swag on their desk, right? Like slowly bring that. People do not like change. Like, I'm one of those rare creatures that absolutely loves change. Most people do not. And so be aware of that there's going to be a lot of questions being asked and a lot of initial pushback. You need to be ready for that. You need to be ready to answer their questions. And that's where that storytelling is so important, right? If you've got a great story that's emotionally appealing, you're going to be able to bring people into your organization and get them on board with it. Again, creating a detailed strategy and tactical plan so that nothing gets missed, and then roll it out to the public. So while it might only take us 3 to 6 months to develop a brand, the rollout can be another 3 to 6 month process. And so really make sure that you have built in the time for a good rollout strategy. And then number 5, evaluate and tweak, right? You might not nail it the first time. You're probably not going to be tweaking the visuals, but again, the visuals are just the visuals. You want to be prepared to tweak that brand voice and the storytelling, because once you start telling those stories externally, you're going to start seeing what resonates more with some people than others, and there might be some tweaking to do, right? And I think it's really hard sometimes to measure marketing, right? It's really hard when people ask, what's the ROI? How do we measure that? How do we know if we're achieving our goals? But I do think that there's certain things that you can put into place, which you probably already have in your marketing plan, like increase tourism by X%, increase awareness of the region by X%, increase investment attraction inquiries by an X%. So you can put some type of measurables in there. And I think that's important to have them and to benchmark them, because people want to see quantitative data, right? They want to see increases. And so if you've got these objectives, it's really going to help guide your key decision makers to make sure the branding initiative is effective or needs some tweaks. And, don't be afraid to tweak that brand message and that brand voice, but give it time. Because while you see it every day over and over and over, your audiences do not. And so really you want to give your strategy 8 to 14 months to take root and achieve those established objectives before you decide you need to go in and tweak, unless you're out there telling these stories and you're getting reactions that are not good. And obviously then you're going to want to course correct right away, but that's pretty rare case. George, you have anything to add?
I think those are fantastic points. And I think that it's the openness to evolving those tweaks, whether they're minor or more significant, I think is an important point to make, that folks oftentimes feel like when they launch a brand, they're stuck with it, so to speak, right? You've committed, you don't, gosh, you step back a bit, there might be some pushback. So I think it's an important point to make, that it's okay if you have to make some refinements and you have to deviate a bit from the initial launch, as long as it's strategic and purposeful though as well, right? That there's a reason. It's not just knee-jerk, oh, they didn't like it, I immediately have to throw it out, but that there is an understanding of why, but that openness to this living, breathing thing, it's an important consideration for sure.
Right. And so people ask me often, like, how often should we update our brand? And again, I'm gonna talk about a brand separate from the visuals. So most of the time when you're adjusting a brand, it's probably in alignment with some strategic planning that you're doing. And generally, strategic planning is a 3 to 5 year exercise. And so I generally will look at that brand, and about every 3 to 5 years, we're reassessing the brand's identity. Usually that's more voice, tone, key considerations, things like that. The visuals, maybe or maybe not. Some companies, their visuals will last forever. Ours, I think we were year 7 when we realized, we have really changed as an organization in these 7 years, and our brand visual should reflect that as well. So I think, you don't want to constantly be changing your brand, especially the visuals of the brand, but you do want to keep a pulse on the voice of your brand, because your audiences may change. If not year to year, at least every 3 years, you're probably writing a new strategic plan and relooking at your audiences, your objectives, your mission, your vision. And every time you do that is when you're going to want to come back and look at your voice and your unique selling proposition.
Your truth, there's a couple of things that you said that really resonated with me. First, I love the idea of getting the employees engaged early in the brand and really letting them own it and own the story. I think that, I've seen, city rollouts, organization rollouts, where the next day the story's in the paper and you've got employees who are also being vocal about not liking the new brand. So I love that idea of engaging them and letting them own that story. And again, going back to the whole concept of storytelling, sometimes that, pitching that brand internally or externally is about that storytelling, right? I mean, that's probably the most critical element. And I have an example, and it's not a brand example, but it gives you an idea of like how quickly perception can change. So we have in downtown, we have an owner, a business owner, who kind of has the Midas touch. Everything he creates turns to gold. So he owns Joe's Real Barbecue, and he created Topo, which is essentially a building that has a roadside architecture piece on top. It's a giant gopher. He built this entire thing in a black box, so people didn't know what was being built, unveils it, and we had the public come out in droves against this building. You know, why would you ever build this? This gopher doesn't, it doesn't make sense in downtown Gilbert. This is crazy. And the next day, here's Joe Johnston on Facebook, on, you know, on different media channels talking about his his vision. And so Gilbert was turning 100. Gilbert Road is our main street, and Main Street America used to have giant roadside architecture pieces. You can see them. I'm sure people have seen like the giant donuts or dinosaurs or various like creatures. And his contribution to the community was this roadside architecture piece. And all of a sudden, when he started telling this story, people got behind it and they said, you know, actually, that does make a lot of sense for Gilbert. And I really do like it. And I will tell you, the last time I was in Los Angeles, I happened to be talking to a person at, like, you know, sitting, waiting for my plane. And they said, "Oh, you're from Gilbert? I had somebody bring me to Gilbert when I was in the greater Phoenix area. And I will never, ever forget your gopher." So it's just, it's interesting how all of that comes about. But I think, you know, that story behind the brand, which was so critical. And without that, we probably would have had a longer outcry period about that building.
That is such a great story and so clearly illustrates exactly what I was trying to express here. Great storytelling is what's going to draw people in and help them embrace that brand. Any other questions before we move into the web design portion of this conversation?
I have a question. Hi, this is Margie Adler from the town of Oro Valley. Deirdre,
Hi.
I'm just wondering, earlier you mentioned something about checking in with people. And I'm just curious, what are some other ways to check in with people and see how it's going along before you really put something out there?
Oh, well, just dialogue. I think, you know, dialogue is so
Is
important. So those people that you called and surveyed in the beginning, call them 6 months in and resurvey them. That's your first one, is that's because it's such an easy benchmark to say this person said this and now they're saying this. So I think
Okay.
that's a really easy benchmark. I think also, you know, a lot of the things that we like to use, and I'm sure George does too, is, you know, where people are clicking on the website, how long they're staying in certain portions, e-marketing, really making sure I'm using my analytics and my e-marketing to say, are people clicking more now?
Okay.
Same with my social media, things like that. But I think the number one thing is just reassessing those people you originally talked with.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions before we move into web design?
I had a quick question about these kind of 5 branding strategies, or 5 steps. So I was kind of thinking more so from like a public lens. On the private side, they have a little bit more money to kind of make some robust changes. But I've got to assume the 2 biggest challenges are time commitment, well, 3, time commitment, money, and then who's going to manage it, and who are the people. And so what do you do if you're a smaller town and you just don't really have the budget or the manpower, so to speak, to like go through a big new rebrand? And that seems like that'd be pretty daunting.
I think people think rebranding is a lot more daunting than it actually is. And I think the bigger the organization is what makes it so daunting. So if you're a smaller organization, you're a lot more nimble to do things. And so I think that, you know, branding can be as complicated as someone makes it. And it's funny, I'll never forget, we were actually sitting in a board retreat, Amanda, like, I don't know, 10 years ago. And I was talking with someone down in Yuma, and we were talking about rebranding AED at the time. And someone was like, that's going to be a $50,000 proposition. And I was like, who are you people talking to? Like, it does not have to be a $50,000 proposition. It's as complicated as you make it to be. And so the process is the process, how in depth you get in that process, how many people you survey, all of that scales to the size of your organization. And again, how far do you need to move the needle, right? If you only need to move it this much, it's not that much work. If you need to move it this much, you know, I think just like in construction, Chad, it's always, what is it? Time, money, and quality are the 3-legged prong, right? And it's the same thing. And so if you don't have a lot of money, then you'll find the time, right, to do the work yourself, or, you know, engage with a consulting firm on a limited basis. They don't have to do your entire rebrand. Like with Gilbert, I just came in and helped with the initial assessment period. They ran with it from there, but they just needed an outside voice to kind of ask questions, poke holes, help them determine the questions that they were going to use. But they did all the surveys themselves. They did all the rebrand themselves. And so everything's scalable. But that's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. Anything else before we move to websites? No. All right, George, take it away.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, let's dive in. So, thinking a bit, touching on a point that Deirdre made about the rollout strategy, right? So, one of those components should absolutely be your website. And for most organizations, public or private, a website is really one of your key marketing tools. It's certainly one of your most visible. And for the best part of what you're doing too is it's a living, breathing being. So it's something that you should be able to easily evolve, update, maintain, certainly more cost effective than reprinting 10,000 brochures or ordering swag, etc. So when you think about your website, think about it in the sense that beyond it being a powerful marketing tool, it's also one that you have a lot of control over. You have a lot of flexibility in, and one that you really should be maximizing within that realm. So let's talk a bit about some of the things that we're seeing, the key issues within the economic development website space. And if you jump to the next slide for me, please. All right, so we've broken this down just to make it a little bit more digestible, but some of the top issues that we're seeing when we look at economic development websites, and this is across the country. This is not something unique to Arizona or elsewhere. This is really a global thing that we're seeing. But we've broken this down into two main buckets, if you will, primary and secondary topics. And one of the main primary ones is when we think about what one of the big assets of a particular community is, it's the available land, property, sites, etc. We're also seeing a lot of communities not do a fantastic job of promoting that. So when you're thinking about one of the assets that you're putting out there for site selectors, developers, etc., certainly you want to have that presented very well. So we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute, but certainly making your available land and property accessible is key. Right behind that, and then pretty equal to that, is talking about the demographics of your particular community. So thinking about the breakdown of the profile of your community, it's great to have information, but it's not very powerful if it's outdated or incomplete or irrelevant, depending on the types of data that you're sharing about your key demographics. So we'll touch on that. And then third in this initial grouping here is your key industries and sectors that are unique. And this really is one of those points that ties back to, Deirdre made some great points, but this is one of those where also what is unique about your community versus others that you are near or that are across the state. Certainly there's a lot of communities sharing industries and sectors, but within those, what are some of your unique offerings? And so we're going to talk about that a bit as well, but having those up front is also key. And then in our second bucket here, a little, not necessarily less important, but that doesn't necessarily give as much stage time, if you will, on websites, but your market access, your location. So bearing in mind, again, going back to our point about who your target audience is. So when you're thinking about promoting your particular community, who are you promoting it to? Who are you trying to promote it to? So bearing in mind that they may be very unfamiliar with your location, not only where you are in the state, but for a smaller community, it might be that you're even in the state. So and we're seeing a lot of communities that share similar names and engage with this community similar to Peoria, right? Like, well, is it Peoria, Arizona? Is it Illinois? Which Peoria is it? So we want to make sure that you're also sharing where you're located. But beyond that, there's also some key components of thinking again about your audience and how they would access your particular community assets. So it's not just putting a pin drop on a map. It's also sharing some of your modalities. So is there major interstates, airport, freight access, rail, et cetera? I'm going to talk more about that. And then lastly here in these assets, things that you want to think about is your quality of life, your QOL. So what are the main amenities and assets that you can and should be promoting via your website? And it means a lot of things, and we'll talk in some detail about that as well. So one last comment though real quick here, and this is just a consideration. I know it'll be a factor for communities who where budget might be a concern, or also where you have, say, your economic development department nested within a larger department, or is just part of your regional, your community website or county website. Give some thought to potentially a standalone website. And an important consideration with that is it doesn't automatically mean it has to be branded differently per se. So a point that Deirdre made about sometimes there's value in having your economic development identity still part of the city community identity, but there can be a bit of a differentiation. And one really important consideration with this town site is it says to site selectors, developers, et cetera, that you are elevating the importance of economic development in your community. And that does not mean that other departments or functions are inferior or less important or less, critical to your community. But when you're thinking about the purpose and the mission of economic development, it elevates it a bit in the community, gives it a little more prominence, and that does get on the radar for site selectors and developers. So with that, let's dive right in. So let's talk about the first one, and that is the site listing. So there's a lot of ways you can approach this, but two of the most common ways that we're seeing in terms of making your available properties accessible via your website, there's the sometimes more expensive solution, which is using a third-party service. And there are multiple. Some of the big ones out there is the Zoom Prospector from GS Planning. There's also CoStar, LoopNet, and many of you might already be using some of these tools. I know some of you are. One consideration is that a lot of these tools do require a subscription, a paid subscription, usually annually, but the benefit is you also get basically an off-the-shelf tool. And so when you're thinking about bandwidth of your staff or what you want to put out there, how comprehensive you want it, sometimes the third-party tools are just the most effective solution for more bang for your buck. But for instances where perhaps you're in a smaller community or just not wanting to commit those particular financial resources to it, that doesn't mean that you can't do an equally good job in promoting your available properties. And so there's other solutions that are available for those of you who have platforms such as WordPress, or if you're using, say, Civic Plus or Granicus. A lot of them also have tools, add-ons, plugins that you can use to, within your existing tool, show off in sort of a database format. So you can have searchable listings, you can have downloadable flyers, you can have other resources that don't necessarily require a separate paid subscription. You're just leveraging the tools that exist within the platform that you're using, your CMS, your content management system. So, so certainly don't feel as though if you can't invest the funds necessarily to use a third-party service, that automatically means you can't do an equally good job in promoting your properties. But bearing in mind, regardless of which solution that you choose, don't forget that you have a wide range, you potentially have a wide range of properties to promote, sites to promote. It doesn't automatically mean or shouldn't mean that you're only sharing on the commercial side, industrial side, etc. Bearing in mind that folks might be looking for a mix or a very specific type of site. So it might be raw land they want. They might want something shovel ready. They may want office or retail space. So when you put all of this information out through your website, make it as broad and all encompassing as possible, so you're maximizing the potential reach of the information that you're sharing. And then one additional thought there too is that for those of you who do have opportunity zones or foreign trade zones or other corridors that might be unique, or even if they're not necessarily unique to your community, but it's available, certainly have that information out on your website and identify it as such. Those are important keywords that folks are looking at. So don't bury it or make it hard to find. If you have those sites, make sure that they're available and easily to identify. I'll give you an example here of one way to do this. So the town of Gilbert is using the service CoStar. So it's a simple mapping tool. And here's just a little screenshot that shows you basically how you have all these available sites listed. You can click on any of the pin drops and get information about the representative agent. You can find size, the type of property, etc. So it's a simple service and very familiar for folks who use any type of mapping tool, essentially. All right, moving on to our second topic. So demographics and the importance of them. So it's critical, absolutely critical, that you have demographic data on your community website. But equally critical is that it is current as is available to you. And when I say current, what I'm thinking is that you are not putting information out that is 2010, 2012, really even 2015 for a lot of folks is this data. And understanding that the 10-year census data isn't always, it's spread apart, obviously, but you have American Community Survey data, you have other private consultants that sometimes produce data you can have more readily available, but keeping it as current as is available to you is critical. Also because it's a rapidly changing environment. And so as your population is changing, or your profile of your average median home price, et cetera, those evolve very quickly, especially right now. You don't want to have outdated information because it could be a disadvantage. if you're not on par with, say, a neighboring community who might be vying for a similar relocate or business to come to the community. So when we think about demographics, so current or otherwise, we typically break them down into two groups, the primary and secondary. So the main ones that we think about as primary include your population. And it's really important that you're not just putting out what your current population is. You should also be showing your prior and projected. So you want to show your historic population and what your population counts have been over the years. And generally folks are going back at least 10 years, but depending on your community and the newness of your community or periods where you had just fantastic growth, you may want to expand that range. But certainly looking ahead at projected growth. So what between now and potential build out of your community, what incrementally you're expecting, it really shows how your particular community has evolved from a resident count standpoint. So really looking back and looking ahead is as important as having just your current population as well. Also in your primary demographics is thinking about the education level of your residents. So making sure that you're breaking that down as best you can, that it's not just saying something to the effect of we have a highly educated population. That's great, but what does that really mean? Are we talking about advanced degrees? Are we talking about just some college? So we recommend that you really think about breaking these down into smaller buckets of information, looking at and not discrediting folks that say have a trade credential or associate's degree. It's not to say that they don't provide value to the workforce. So bear in mind that you shouldn't only look at a four-year degree or PhD, masters, etc. That you want to really cover all of the buckets of any higher education. And so we recommend that you really break that down into smaller groupings so you can show that diversity, still while showing that you have an educated population, of course. Income also. So this is really important. It's probably equally important to not only the job seekers, but as families think about relocating. And in an instance where perhaps you have a trailing spouse or you have one member of the household who is a stay-at-home parent, this is an important consideration as folks are thinking about what the average wage is, median income for your community is as they think about for their respective family, where they need to be in terms of making a comfortable living in your community. And then the age demographics is another one. So the breakout, is it a younger population, middle-aged population, or is it a slightly older population? And again, I think sometimes there's a misconception that if you do have a very young or a very old or older population, that's a disadvantage, and it really isn't. It also gives you an opportunity, talking again about what's unique about your community, is why that makeup is the way it is and sharing that information. So I think that's an important consideration as well. So when you give age information, also break that out a bit. Don't just say it's 25 and above is 90% of our population. But make sure you give some, at least in 20-year increments if you can. So thinking about some of the secondary demographics, and these are ones that we generally say, depending on your community, and if there are certain sensitivities that you want to avoid, some of these may come into play and may not. So race and ethnicity, certainly to show diversity within your community is wonderful. So it's a really important one when you do have any demographics that you also, again, like in many of the other buckets, you don't say this is our population of only these two demographic or these two ethnic groups. Try to be as all-encompassing as possible so that you show that diversity is broad. So as much as you can that's relevant to your community, break them down to smaller groups so you show there is more diversity. Also one, median home value. And I know, Arizona's on fire. So you have such growth happening all over. And so I realize that this is one of those where sometimes it's great to show that it's affordable in other communities that perhaps where home prices are really just skyrocketing. It may sometimes could be a negative perception that might be very costly within your community. So that's why I say it's one of those where you use your judgment as it works for your particular community. But median home value is very popular demographic to show. And then lastly is the commute times. So as folks who, especially ones who are not familiar with your community, are trying to get their bearing on if they say reside within your city limits, but perhaps need to commute for work elsewhere, or vice versa, giving some idea of what the average commute times are to nearby major communities that they might be either going to for employment, or they might reside in and come to your community for employment. So it shows proximity and ease of access. So again, with all the demographics that you do put on the website, do it in a really presentable manner. So here's an example City of Maricopa has done. So make it digestible. We all have such little limited time, and our attention span is waning even more and more these days. So we always say give them digestible nuggets of information. Infographics, iconography work really well, but make it easy to digest, quick takeaways, and then absolutely lastly, make sure you cite every single source. So any demographic data that you're going to put on your website, you need to validate it by citing the source that you pulled it from.
George, as we move on, I just wanted to, just for you and Deirdre, we've got about 5 minutes, so.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. So next one is, so target industries and sectors are critical. So when you're thinking about how you're going to differentiate your community and or how you're going to promote the sectors that you may say share with a neighboring community, it's really important that those are up on your website and that they're easy to find and that they're defined. So if you have 3, 4, 5, 6 key sectors in your particular community, make sure that those are all available, that there's information about each one that is as current as possible. Again, describes who your major employers are, gives employment counts even, tied into education. So if it's particular sectors that require advanced degrees, share that information. And whatever you do have on the site, make sure it's also available as some type of downloadable resource. So there is a takeaway that the recipient can easily download a PDF or print something on their own office or home computer and keep with them, so that it's not, they don't have to return to the website every time to get that. And a quick example of how that's done well here, Chandler's done a great job. So we've got these quick little buckets, gives you a photo, title, a little teaser text, and a link to learn more. So it's digestible, it's easy to take a look at and move on quickly, but you know what they're promoting. So that's one way to do it well. All right, so talking about market access, and again, this is where your community is within relation to neighboring forms of transportation. So we recommend a really visual approach to this information. So a nice custom map graphic doesn't have to be super elaborate, but something a bit more than say just a Google map, thumbnail or screenshot, but something that shows where your particular community is located to major cities, regional, international airports, major interstates, other modes of transportation. If freight or passenger rail is relevant to your particular community, certainly for logistics, so transportation, ground transportation, key, but highlight all of those. Don't just think that folks are only going to drive or fly into your community. So make sure whatever your access points are, you're promoting all of them. And then a good consideration is also travel times. So again, it's a 2-hour flight from my community to X, or it's a 4-hour drive. Make sure all of that information is there. And an example of one easy, simple way to do this, Flagstaff has done this with iconography, quick little paragraphs, some text that explains versus different modes of transportation. So clean and simple way to present that. And then last, but still very, very important when we're thinking about websites, is the quality of life assets and amenities. And an important note to make is I see a lot of communities tend to think that this primarily means their tourism offering, and that it isn't only that. That is a component of it, but when you're thinking of your quality of life assets, think about for your residents, what are the various things when they are not at work, when they're not at their desk, what are the things that are going to matter to them? And bear in mind that that should not only be for a single person or just for a married or just families, it should be for everyone. So when you're thinking about these, cover your bases, but it should include what are your medical facilities, what's your public safety information, housing and neighborhoods, what is your offering in that regard? And then of course the other, the dining, the nightlife, the attractions, those types of amenities. But make sure that you cover all of those bases for anything that a resident would care about when they're thinking about potentially coming to your community as a worker, or if they want to relocate, living in your community, working elsewhere. But again, that it covers all of those different types of individuals. And an example of this, how this is done well, I'm here on Avondale's site. Nice photo, quick little intro, and as you scroll through the page, you have additional information about the various types of assets and amenities. So just a clean, simple way to do that. That, a few minutes for questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat box. We've got 1 minute if we have one question anyone has. If not, you will have both Deirdre and George's information, and they're both in the Whova app underneath. Their bios are underneath the presenter. So feel free to reach out to them with any questions that you may have. They're both fantastic to work with. We've had a great working relationship with both of them for years. All right, seeing no questions, I just wanted to thank both Deirdre and George today. You guys did a fantastic job that was really informative, and just love to have the dialogue. And thank you to all of the attendees. Let's see here. We have a 10-minute break before our last general session starts here at 11:30. So feel free to go stretch your legs, and we'll see you at 11:30. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.